Hi, I'm Julie Cohen, and I'm one of the director producers of the documentary RBG, as well as a documentary filmmaker on a host of other films.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
We welcome today Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
She's become such an icon.
Would you mind signing this copy?
I am 84 years old, and everyone wants to take a picture with me.
Notorious RBG. Yeah.
When you come right down to it, the closest thing to a superhero I know. Ruth Bader Ginsburg changed the way the world is for American women.
I became a lawyer when women were not wanted by the legal profession.
Thousands of state and federal laws discriminated on the basis of gender. She was following in the footsteps of the battle for racial equality. She wanted equal protection for women.
Men and women are persons of equal dignity, and they should count equally before the law.
She captured for the male members of the court what it was like to be a second-class citizen.
The point is that the discriminatory line almost inevitably hurts women.
I did see myself as kind of a kindergarten teacher in those days because the judges didn't think sex discrimination existed.
I have had the great good fortune to share life with a partner truly extraordinary for his generation.
He was the first boy I ever knew who cared that I had a brain.
She is a center of power on and off the court.
Every time Justice Ginsburg wrote a dissent, the internet would explode.
I came up with a couple slogans. You can't spell truth without Ruth.
I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of men and women who kept dreams alive.
I've heard that she does 20 push-ups 3 times a week or something. I mean, we can't even get off the floor. We can't even get down to the floor.
That's true.
That is the trailer for the documentary RBG, and this is Factual America. Factual America is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for an international audience. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and every week we look at America through the lens of documentary filmmaking by interviewing filmmakers and experts on the American experience. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, to find out where you can see our films, and to connect with our team. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away on September 18, 2020, after a long and illustrious career as an advocate for gender equality, a jurist, and most famously as an Associate Justice on the United States Supreme Court. Joining us to pay tribute to this true American icon is Julie Cohen, the co-director of RBG, the 2018 documentary that beautifully captures the life and legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The film itself was nominated for an Academy Award and is one of the top-grossing documentaries of all time. We caught up with Julie from her home in Brooklyn, New York. Julie Cohen, welcome to Factual America. Julie, how are things there in Brooklyn, New York?
Things in Brooklyn and throughout my beautiful United States are, pretty insane right now, I guess would be the best word I could use to describe it, with events unfolding minute by minute in such a way that I expect that the world, when this goes up in 3 days from now, is going to be a completely different world than the world we're in right now. But that's how 2020 has been in a lot of the world, but I think particularly in the U.S.
Yeah, indeed. And just for clarity's sake for our listeners out there, today's October 3rd. I think it's important to put a time stamp on this. No big surprise. It is a surprise, but what's happened is we know Donald Trump's been diagnosed with COVID-19. But that's not the main reason, or a reason really, why we're here and asked you to come on, Julie. As most of our listeners will know, is Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away on September 18th, 2020, after a long, illustrious career. She was an advocate for gender equality, Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And you're the co-director and co-producer of the film RBG, which came out in 2018. Premiered at Sundance, was nominated for an Academy Award, one of the top 30 grossing documentaries of all time. So thanks so much for coming on to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
I gather it's I know I saw it on Netflix. I know CNN was streaming it for free a few weeks ago. Is Netflix the best way for people to see it? If
you know, in England, I think that's true. In the UK at large, it, you know, as you know, with film distribution, it gets pretty complicated, and it depends where you live. But you know, I actually noticed on Twitter that our British distributor Dogwoof was bringing it back to some theaters this past week. So it is actually in some theaters. Even it's been in it was re-released in theaters in the U.S. last week, and I know there are some theaters in Great Britain that are either playing it in person or virtually as well.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw Dogwoof had a credit. I saw BFI was on there. That's a very good point to make. We also have listeners from around the world, so I'm sure if you do a Google search, it
really varies country by country. In the U.S. right now, it's on CNN Go, but it's also on Hulu, and you know, I think iTunes, Amazon, almost anywhere. It just depends. Google it, you shall find it.
And it goes without saying, whatever your political persuasion or none, please watch it. It's a wonderful film. There's a reason it was nominated for an Academy Award, I can tell you. So, and I had a chance to watch it again in the last 24 hours. So, thank you again for making that film. I mean, let's take this opportunity to have a bit of a looking back on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life. And Julie, maybe you can start us off. You got a chance to work with her closely on the doc. Seems like you had all access interviews. What are your memories of Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
You know, I guess my main memories of Justice Ginsburg are the personal ones. Her persona is of being quite a serious, quiet, soft-spoken intellectual person, and she was all of those things. Mm-hmm. But she also had a different side to her. She had a real kind of glimmer in her eye, a real spirit of joy, a great sense of humor. You know, some of the moments I'll remember most clearly are having the opportunity to see her both watch and perform in operas at the Washington National Opera in DC at the world famous Kennedy Center. She played a speaking part in an opera called Daughter of the Regiment. The role she played was the Duchess of Krakenthorpe, and she really loved to say the word Krakenthorpe. And you know, seeing her in those settings, we also were at the Santa Fe Opera with her when she was an audience member for two separate operas, and just seeing like the level to which she was entranced by art in general and opera in particular. We also went to a museum with her, something we filmed but didn't end up including in the film, or just any time one talked to her about books, movies, Broadway or opera. She just loved those things, or even actually being in her home. She has some works of art on the wall, and she would tell you the provenance and every single thing about any work of art she had. She was just like a deep art lover. And you know, someone who would just get completely engrossed in something that she loved. And I guess that's a side to her that I think fewer people saw, and that was really lovely to behold.
I think it makes me think of a scene from the film, actually. I'm assuming that's her office, was her office as a Supreme Court justice, but, you know, we talk about men and their man caves, but she had her sort of woman cave. I think about it, some of this works of art you were talking about, or just, it looked like a lovely place to work for 20 odd years and as a justice? You know?
In the film, we both show a conference room at the Supreme Court, which is where the interview was done, which is kind of a grand thing with old portraits of justices from centuries gone by. Yeah. But in her own private chambers, which is sort of a large office with an anteroom, she has most of the art in there actually are things that were sent to her, often Amazing. From just fans who she didn't know, all kinds of posters and quilts. A lot of them had her own image on them. And if she found them amusing and interesting, she tended to put them up on the wall.
That's interesting. So, I mean, there you are in Brooklyn. She's from Brooklyn. I mean, you talk, I mean, the first half of the film is what I deemed her early life, but actually it takes her up to the age of 60. But, it's a very interesting, background. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that from being these what I would assume are sort of poor background from Jewish, Polish, and Russian immigrants, and making it from there to the streets of Brooklyn all the way to Cornell and eventually Harvard Law School.
Yes, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's family did in fact come from a humble background, something which she was very proud of. Unlike some people from similar backgrounds who sort of are trying to keep it quiet, that they are from kind of a not so privileged and not so educated family. Justice Ginsburg was extremely proud of the immigrant families on both sides. She liked to talk about a smoked fish store on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is the area where Jewish immigrants came and lived in packed tenements, and both her parents had lived there as children. And when she was growing up in Brooklyn, her parents used to take her to that neighborhood, basically just to remind her where she came from. And it was a lesson that she really never forgot. And the fact that she was able to achieve things that her parents, particularly her mother, would have been unable to through her own hard work and education was something she was really proud of, as I think, and rightly so.
Yeah. And for those, it might be difficult for some of us who grew up basically in the world that she created, or some of us may not remember, we're a little bit older. I mean, what was it like for a woman back in the 1950s and 60s when she was first starting off?
Right. I mean, in the 1950s and 60s, even into the 70s, the world for American women was very, very different from the world today in a way that a lot of young women either don't remember or don't know about. A woman couldn't get a credit card or a mortgage in her own name. You had to have your husband sign off on something like that. You could just be fired for being pregnant. Actually, it happened to RBG herself early in her life, such that when she lost a job for being pregnant on her first pregnancy, in her second pregnancy, 10 years later, she chose to completely hide it. She just wore really loose-fitting clothes in the hope that her bosses wouldn't figure it out, which they apparently didn't, or at least they were polite enough not to mention it.
Yeah.
Husbands, either by law or by custom, but depending on the state, were never prosecuted for raping their own wives. It was just viewed as that's a prerogative of marriage. The state of womanhood in the country was very different, and RBG very much experienced that herself. Yeah. She was one of only nine women in a class of 500 at Harvard Law School. The dean of the law school at the beginning of the year, as we mentioned in the film, invited all the women to his home for a dinner, the women in the class, and went around the room asking all of them, explain why you're here taking a place that could be held by a man. When we heard that story from her, it seemed so extraordinary. Subsequently, I've learned from basically any woman who went to law school, medical school, any kind of postgraduate program, told stories of professors asking them that exact same question. That was basically asked of all women, what are you doing here? You don't belong. A pretty harsh way to be treated. Of course, she was a great student. She made law reviews. She ended up transferring to Columbia Law School to follow her husband when he got a job. He was a year ahead of her and got a job as a lawyer in New York. She graduated tied for first in her class at Columbia Law School. So like such a prestigious way to launch, and yet couldn't get a job at the big New York law firms because they just weren't hiring women as lawyers. Like you could get a job as a receptionist or somebody's secretary, but like getting a job as a lawyer was extremely difficult, if not impossible. Made a little more difficult for Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself, as she would point out, for two other reasons. One was that she was Jewish, and many of the basically the big New York law firms were kind of divided into Jewish and non-Jewish firms. And the other being that she already had a child. And like that was viewed as like, oh my God, like how could you be, you know, and in fact, she had already had the child when she went to law school. She managed to really excel as a law student, even while raising a toddler. But, you know, the idea that you could manage to be both a clerk to a judge or a associate at a law firm and like be raising a child seemed, you know, that the men who were hiring just like kind of couldn't process that. So discrimination was definitely a thing. And if Ruth Bader Ginsburg hadn't really intended to go into her career to fight gender discrimination, which absolutely was not her intention, life kind of brought that to her.
Yeah, I mean, I have it's a very good point. I mean, I even a note here that because of that discrimination she faced in terms of not, you know, no one would give her a job, despite having these Harvard and Columbia law classmates vouch for her husband and friends, saying that you have to hire this person.
Right.
I mean, they would have been a power couple. I mean, they were a power couple, and her husband, but I mean, they would have been like top dogs in New York, and yet she, you know, no one would give her a second look. I mean, did she ever say anything about having to transfer from Harvard to Columbia? Any
Oh yeah, she was really mad about that.
Yeah,
like,
I was wondering.
She went to she actually didn't mind following more. I mean, they had a child at that point, so there was really no thought in her mind that she was going to stay in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was definitely going to move to New York for her final year of law school. But she had gone to Harvard saying, "Can I still get my Harvard degree even if I finish out my third year at Columbia?" And they were just like, "No, that's not the policy." Now, you know, in my mind, that was their policy, and it applied to both men and women, and like nobody was going to make an exception for her. So like, that's just kind of life. I mean, she had a good legal argument, which is that there were people who transferred into Harvard after 2 years somewhere else that got a Harvard degree, but like their rule was like, it's where you end up. So ironically, many years later, after she was already a Supreme Court justice, Harvard actually tried persistently to give her a law degree, and she wouldn't take it. I think she did at some point get an honorary degree from them, but she didn't go for the straight out JD. She kind of felt like you missed your chance, guys.
That's I did wonder about that, because I mean, she seemed very, rightfully so, law review at only in her second year at Harvard Law. I mean, that's quite an accomplishment, and then have to leave that. But that's also because Martin, her partner in life, was he'd been very sick, hadn't he? And she was looking after him and a child and going to law school.
Yes, so it was while they were in law school together at Harvard with Marty a year ahead of her that he developed testicular cancer. This was before the era of chemotherapy, and he had very serious, I believe, radiation treatments and and was hospitalized and wasn't able to attend classes. So she went not only to her own classes, she also went and sat in on all his classes and took notes on them, and came and helped him. And, you know, basically for a year of their law school, sort of did law school for the both of them, with little or no complaint, while also raising their 2-year-old at that point child. So when people look at how incredibly supportive he was of her later in life, I think you do have to remember that period, because I think, you know, aside from being a great progressive feminist husband, I think he was just forever grateful for the fact that she really, you know, he wouldn't have had a career at all if not for her, because she had helped him graduate from law school.
Yeah. And I put her in this category of people that often of this, let's call it greatness. How many hours of sleep was she getting a night? And that seems to go on way until the bitter end.
Justice Ginsburg wasn't a big sleeper. She was well, that's a little bit not accurate. She wasn't a big sleeper at night. She stayed up working until late into the night from the time she was in law school all the way through well into her 80s. That was just her vibe. However, getting up early in the morning was also not her thing.
Okay.
We learned that during the making of the film. Like, if you wanted to do something with her before noon, that basically was not going to happen. Okay. The only times that she got up before noon was when she was a sitting Supreme Court justice, and they have arguments that start at 10 in the morning. But like, it's not like they're doing that every day. It's 3 days a week for 2 weeks in a row, and then there's 2 weeks where they're not having arguments. So basically, for 12 mornings, if I'm doing it, well, no, even for less than that, for like, depending on the month, for 6 or maybe 9 or 12 mornings during the month, she was getting up to get to the court for the 10 a.m. oral argument. Other than that, she would basically be like, come in at noon and then work till 9 or 10 at night at work, and then go home and keep working at home.
Okay. And her poor clerks, did they have to keep the similar hours, or was that an option?
Her clerks kept similar hours. It was a stressor to them. They often found, and they would, those we talked to mentioned us, if they didn't, the general protocol of the Supreme Court is that under the guidance of the justices, the clerks are drafting all or parts of the opinions before, with what the justices have told them to do. However, if she assigned them to do something, and say they went home a little early, like 8 or 8:30 at night, thinking that they were going to finish it in the morning, by the time they got it in the next morning, she was like, I already wrote it. Like, it's too late. I'm like, she was like a, get it done kind of person. So, and of course that was seen as sort of a humiliation. So they learned to just stay up late and do the work so that she wouldn't beat them to it.
Well, speaking of a get it done kind of person, I mean, I think many of us, I'm an American, but we all know her for being a Supreme Court justice. But I think what's so great about the film is it deals a lot with her leading role as an advocate for gender equality. And I guess you could say that she was the legal strategist behind the women's movement.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a fair thing to say. And in fact, we thought of that really as being the central part of our film, because while people were aware of her record as a Supreme Court justice, which was starting to get a fair amount of attention by the time our film came out, many people, even people that were big fans of her as the notorious RBG, weren't aware of the role that she had played in America in the 1970s to secure equal rights for the genders under the U.S. Constitution. As I say, it stemmed from discrimination that she had faced, that because she was unable to get the fancy New York law firm job that an Ivy League law school graduate, particularly at the top of their class, might expect, she ended up becoming a legal academic. She became a professor at Rutgers Law School. And while she was teaching there, so now we're like into the late 60s, early 70s, while she's teaching there, her students, her women students, started to come to her and say, like, oh, I'd like to learn more about the legal, what are the legal arguments for women's rights? This was a time when in the US, the women's liberation movement, women's lib, as it was called at that time, was like really all the rage. Like, people were out on the streets, Gloria Steinem, very much a famous figure here, was out fighting for women's rights, along with a number of other people, and just like, the public at large. So it was natural that the law students, the female students, said like, oh, like, but what about, we've heard about civil rights cases, we've heard about fighting for the rights of Black people under the Constitution. What about like females? Like, what's the law of that? And asked about that by her students, she wasn't actually sure of the answer, and she went to the legal library and started looking like, oh, what's the case law in this area? And what she discovered was there really wasn't much. There were a few cases. They had been largely unsuccessful. And, sort of egged on by her students, she started a course in, you know, kind of gender and the law. It wasn't called, like, at the time she was using the term sex, and then she realized whenever she would use the term sex and you're dealing with male lawyers and male judges,
unfortunately,
like everyone got very distracted by that term. So she was actually also a main person behind using the word gender to just, you know, talk about those distinctions. So she started doing some work first with the New Jersey Civil Liberties Union and then with the American Civil Liberties Union to fight for women's rights under the Constitution.
And as you said, there was no case law. So what I think is very interesting about the film and her career is that she didn't just say, okay, I'll take this next case, whatever. I mean, she was so strategic in her thinking, and she's saying, well, we need to build this case law, and what is the best way of building it? And then from her, well, what she considered a defeat, but what really wasn't in one of her first cases, she's like, no, now I know how I have to argue this in front of these 9 men, basically.
Right. So she was very strategic and very careful about choosing cases in a way that's actually quite common now, but was less common when she was doing it. I mean, there's a phrase that American constitutional lawyers and the Supreme Court bar like to say, which is that bad cases make bad law. The reverse of that, of course, is that good cases make good law. So the idea is to try to find good cases. When she was trying to map out a strategy along with her colleagues at the so-called Women's Rights Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, of which she was a co-founder, she very deliberately, you know, you look at like what succeeded before, and the very obvious, you know, role model to shape her career after was Thurgood Marshall, who in the 1940s and 50s had argued a series of cases arguing for racial equality under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I think he argued like 32 cases and won 29 of them. He just had an incredible record, had step by step, had just really moved the ball forward until there was all sorts of, you know, really strong Supreme Court law coming down for equality between the races. He, of course, later became a Supreme Court justice as well. And was one by the time RBG was arguing her cases before the Supreme Court. So she started looking like, how had he done it? Like, he's not just taking any old case that comes in the door. He's thinking like, is this plaintiff gonna bring it, you know, is it gonna, are the facts here gonna be really stark and clear cut? Is the person themselves gonna seem sympathetic? So she just found great cases that they thought could make it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and she argued 6 cases, won 5 of those 6, but in some ways that number isn't even quite high enough because there are a number of cases, including her first case, which she actually, Reed versus Reed, which she wrote the brief on, but she wasn't the one that argued it, so we didn't count that in her batting record. But you know, it was really very much her field of law that she advanced, which in some ways made the arguments easier, because when you're arguing a case before the Supreme Court, the justices are constantly peppering you with questions and trying to dig in to all the previous cases and like the facts, and like, but in this case you said that, you know, there was this and this and this. And normally one of the things that makes it difficult for a lawyer to study for a Supreme Court case is learning all those other cases. In Justice Ginsburg's case, they were largely her own cases. So she really knew the facts and the law and the precedents backwards and forwards. And I think that really helped. It was like she had a specialty. I think that makes it easier.
Hey, what I didn't realize was that that these are tape recorded, these sessions in front of the court, and that was it just that easy just to get, because I think it's very effective what you did was actually playing the words, you know, hearing her in the court, you know, with these different cases.
Yes. So since the 1960s, all Supreme Court cases, although cameras aren't allowed in, all Supreme Court cases have been audio taped. And the battle has been kind of over when they're released. Generally, they're not released on the day of, which has always driven news organizations crazy, because that's when people care to hear about them. Often they would be released. It's changed now. It's gotten much quicker, but it used to be like, 2 months later they'd come, and by that time, like, kind of who cares anymore?
Yeah.
Yes, but you say, was it easy to get them? I mean, yeah, they're on the internet. I mean,
Okay.
like, if you go to, so when the Supreme Court opens in the morning, the session every day, the call to begin the court is a bailiff yelling, "Oyez, oyez!" There's a website called Oyez, OYEZ.org, I think, or .com.
I've looked at it before.
Yeah, on which all these audio tapes exist, and there's transcripts, and there's even a transcript that follows along with the audio. Like, if you skip to a place on the transcript, you'll hear that audio. So, and these are public domain. So, it was extremely easy. It's just there just aren't that well known because they're not played that often, because by the time that they're released, the story isn't newsworthy anymore. So and I actually had worked on a cable TV producing a cable TV show about the Supreme Court in the 1990s. So I was aware of these tapes, and we just went looking for them and listened to all her arguments, and we're like, oh my God, these are incredible. She's amazing. Like, she was so her voice is so quiet, but like, she's so tough, and like, that we decided pretty early on, we want this audio to be a big part of the film, even if you're not seeing her. Like, hearing her voice is incredible.
No, and exactly, and you're not just listening. I mean, you the way you accompany it with the words on the screen and other imagery, I think it was very well done. I think it came as a surprise to me as someone who grew up in the States, and all we got were basically artist renditions of the court, and someone maybe reading some of the
you get the sketches, and you get someone often sort of trying to paraphrase, because a lot of the language that the lawyers are using is just way too insidey. It's kind of hard to follow. One good thing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg throughout her career, both as a lawyer and as a judge, she really thought of herself as an educator as well as an advocate. So more than most lawyers or judges, she tried to write some of her stuff in language that a regular person was going to be able to understand.
I think so we've talking about her being in front of the court, but then she starts her career as a jurist, and I thought she's the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. District, which listeners may not realize is probably the second most important court in the land. And she was there, and that's where she actually first met Antonin Scalia, which
and where she became very close friends with him. So.
Yeah, and she also was on the same court with Bork, which is it must have been an interesting combination of people. But then this Supreme Court position opens up. Bill Clinton seems to be hemming and hawing, and this is even there. It wasn't even a slam dunk, was it? At first, I mean. She was already 60 years old.
Right. And she was already 60, which is considered to be like, one thing, because justices do have lifetime tenure. They like to appoint younger people so that they can last longer. Of course, as it turned out, Justice Ginsburg ended up being one of the longest serving justices ever. She was extremely proud of that longevity. There was a certain date within the period that we were filming the movie that she became the longest serving Jewish justice, and she was super proud of that and would talk about it all the time. She was not at all the obvious choice, not only because she was older than most candidates would be, but because she was virtually unheard of. Although I talk about like that she played this major role in securing women's rights under the law, like people didn't really care about that. It just wasn't a famous movement while it was unfolding. If you go look for articles of those cases, although they seem like important cases now, they're buried pretty deep in the paper. They almost never mentioned her name because who cared? She was like some random civil liberties lawyer. And nor were they in law school books. I mean, I was in law school in the 1990s, and these cases aren't in your constitutional law books. Like they just weren't considered a big deal. I actually in the course of the film coming out, I went to a screening where I met a judge in New Jersey. He just came as an audience member who had been at Rutgers Law School at the time she was teaching there. he said he was very much an activist. He was really into civil rights and and Martin Luther King's movement for civil rights. He was really into anti-Vietnam War protests. But he said when he learned that Professor Ginsburg was taking these courses on women's rights laws, he was like, me and my leftist friends, they were like, what is that? That is so stupid. Like, why do you need women's rights laws? Like as a good friend of Justice Ginsburg, Judge Harry Edwards says in the film, like, they just didn't get it. Like, we don't even understand what these ladies are talking about. We open the doors for them. We pay for their dinner on dates. Everyone's nice to ladies. Like, what are they complaining about?
What more do they want? I think what's interesting because we had the people from Crip Camp on earlier.
Oh, I love that movie.
And it's amazing because that's what I think what's happening with documentary filmmaking. I mean, we'll talk about this after the break, but there are all these stories that you thought were told, but now we're realizing haven't been told. And so that documents the disability rights movement, which, you look back, these are amazing cases, but how much publicity did they get at the time?
No, I'm interested that you mentioned that because I love that. I love that documentary, and I very much had the reaction seeing that film that a lot of people had to ours, which was like, how did I not know this story? Yeah. Like, there's an incredible scene in that where the disability rights activists are doing like a sleep-in, like where they've sort of taken over a building in California, and the Black Panthers come in to like support the movement and like serve them, dinner and like these, little tins with Sterno underneath them. And like the story is incredible. And there's this amazing footage. And it's like, I had no idea. Like, it's like how the disability rights movement came to be, why it is that there are ramps that allow you to get into buildings, and like didn't know anything about how it happened, and didn't know any of the people that had made it so.
I mean, and it's almost embarrassing because I remember the only first I remember hearing about is I was living in Washington D.C. in the early '90s, and my first job, and they started doing work on the men's restrooms because they had to lower the urinals, and I'm like, what's this all about? And now you would just not even think twice. Of course, what the impediments we were putting these people's lives, and not taking into account.
We tend to think of those kind of changes as something that come from legislators or maybe from the courts. But like, the American Disabilities Act didn't happen because a bunch of like members of Congress were like, oh, let's actually make buildings more accessible to, to people who have physical challenges. Like, no, it's because the people who were struggling with, unfair systems went out incredibly aggressively against all odds, fighting for their own rights. And it is absolutely the same case with the civil rights movement, with the women's rights movement, with the gay rights movement, with now the trans rights movement. Nobody gives you any rights until you go out and fight for them. That's just how it goes.
Well, I think that's a good point for to give our listeners a bit of a break. So let's do that, and we will be back shortly with Julie Cohen.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America.
Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Julie Cohen, the award-winning co-director and co-producer of RBG, the film about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, available in various places. Google it. I know you can find it on Netflix. I think Hulu in the States has it. Julie, we were talking obviously about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was the second woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor being the first. Did you think about including her at all in the film? Did you reach out to Justice O'Connor?
Justice O'Connor, as she has subsequently announced, is suffering from Alzheimer's disease and was already at the time we were making the film, so was not in a position to be interviewed, something we regretted a lot because actually that transfer of, Justice O'Connor played a role in RBG's career, including especially when RBG was a young justice, and what became her most famous majority ruling, opening up the Virginia Military Institute to women. When that case came before the court, it was Sandra Day O'Connor's to write the majority opinion. She was more senior, and she gave it to RBG to write. She was just like, you know what, the gender equality law is all yours, Ruth.
Yeah.
Like, you need to write this opinion, even though RBG was quite new at that point, had only been on the court for 3 years. So it was actually an incredibly important role in the justice's career, but we were unable to interview Justice O'Connor.
Okay, well, I had heard that, and I wasn't sure because certainly of the timings. I mean, it is of probably the least importance of things to be discussed, but they did develop this new sort of uniform, if you will, for women justices. The sort of the lace-like collar they put on. Is it true, you've got this iconic poster, but is it true that the poster originally just included an image of the is it called a jabot? I forget.
It's called the jabot, yes.
Jabot, yeah. You see,
yes, and in fact, as the film does mention, that is another legacy of Justice O'Connor. You know, you're as a justice, you have to wear a black robe. That's the uniform of being a judge. But there always has been, including for the male justices, the opportunity to embellish that a little bit. Chief Justice Rehnquist had a nice like to decorate his with little stripes, like from Gilbert and Sullivan kind of look.
I remember that from the impeachment hearings. Yeah.
And when Justice O'Connor came on the court, she, as the first woman, she was like, you know, I'd really like to add a little dash of femininity. So she started adding these like nice white lace collars to her robe. And when RBG came in, Justice O'Connor was like, hey, I think she may have even given her one. She's like, hey, this is a way to kind of like jazz up your robe a little bit. Justice Ginsburg liked that. She kind of ran with it. She started wearing different decorative ones. And then as that became more of a thing, friends and law students and fans started sending her like all different ones. And it was she herself, it seems, who came up with the idea of, when she was going to read an opinion from the bench, that she would wear a collar signifying what she was going to read. She had a certain collar that she wore as a majority opinion collar if she was going to read that. And she had this collar which was a little bit black and sparkly and spiky that she called her dissent collar. And, you know, court watchers used to love it because you'd come into court in the morning and even before opinions were read, you'd be like, you knew that RBG was going to be reading a dissent because she was wearing her dissent collar.
That's funny.
I'll add, because it's relevant to the current political situation, there were those who noted that in the first court session following President Trump's election, RBG came into the court wearing her dissent collar.
Okay. Well, actually, now that you mentioned that, I mean, I've seen New York Times had a recent good article on this about this issue. Did you ever broach it with her about why she didn't retire and give, for instance, President Obama a chance to nominate someone in her place?
Yeah, I mean, we asked her about that, as kind of, and you know, almost everyone did once Trump was elected.
It's a sensitive issue, I know.
You know, her answer was, it was sort of twofold. One is like, she was confident she was going to be able to continue to serve. She was a woman who had a lot of confidence in her own stamina, I would say. Another that she would point it out pretty frequently, and which I do think has some real relevance, was the fact that, remember that in February of 2016, you know, you could do the math, but a full like 9 months, I think that would be. But before the next presidential election, her buddy, Justice Scalia, died unexpectedly, and the Republican Senate stood in the way of nominating a new justice. So if Justice Ginsburg had been considering retiring at the end of Obama's administration, which she may well have been doing to that point, she then was sort of boxed into this situation where that would not have been possible, because even in February there wasn't going to be a justice replacing Scalia. But I think one thing that one has to factor in is that, like everyone else in the country on both sides, nobody thought that Donald Trump was going to be elected president. Like She just, I think in Justice Ginsburg's mind, Hillary Clinton was going to be elected president, and she was going to be in a situation, you know, to serve on the court as under the first woman president.
Yeah.
You know, potentially, who knows, as a first female chief justice. I mean, there's, you know, I think it would have been a different calculation had she been able to envision a Republican president. None of us were thinking that was going to happen.
Yeah, and I think, but I mean, do you think there's some other? I mean, obviously, there's many elements to these sort of decisions, but she, I mean, this is her life. This was her life. She was, you know, she was so dedicated, and she even threw herself into it from 2010. For our listeners who may not be aware, I mean, the positions are for life, I think, as you've already mentioned, Julie, and it's a real no-no, really, at least by tradition and constitutionally, for politicians to start meddling with the court in such a way. And I gather she didn't take, not that she didn't take too kindly, she just kind of ignored entreaties early on in the Obama administration when they
right. Well, you know, reporting that's come out over the past couple weeks since the justice passed away has been that in a lunch that she had with Obama, that he hinted, although did not directly request, but hinted, you know, Ruth, maybe you should think about whether you want to stay on, you know, or perhaps step down before the next, and that basically she just didn't take the bait. She didn't argue with him and say no, but she sort of didn't really acknowledge having heard that argument, and that he didn't push it. I mean, that might be somewhat hard to believe from the outside. I mean, he was the president of the United States. Why not just say what was on his mind? But you have to understand, Justice Ginsburg was a very intimidating woman. Tiny though she might have been, and with her quiet little voice, she just had this whole force and like this penetrating stare, and just everything about her was quite intimidating. And so Obama never directly said, like, Ruth, please, I think you should step down. He sort of tiptoed around it maybe, and she just like pushed right past that.
Well, I think you hit on it. Certainly the. I mean, you've got this great archival. I mean, there's plenty of great archival. I mean, even the family stuff or someone's family home movies that you have access to. But the confirmation hearings, you know, just the way you see these grizzly old men. I don't know if there was a woman on the Judiciary Committee at that hearing, but you know, and even then Biden seemed a bit old. But you know, the senators seemed to have fallen in love with her. You know, she's quite an imposing figure.
Yeah, but both, you know, in the film we interview two of her childhood friends who used the term, one of them uses the term quiet magnetism, and I think that is a really good description. It's hard to describe. She was an extremely magnetic person, like, which is weird because you think of it someone who's like the life of the party and whatever. She's super quiet, but like she was really magnetic. She was really beautiful. And her smartness kind of emanated out of her. And you could just see it in the faces of the Judiciary Committee members, including the Republicans.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Orrin Hatch. I mean,
who were just, they were just sort of dazzled by her. Like the combination of this little, you know, cute, tough lady who's just speaking her mind. And she was charming. Like they really just ate it up. Yeah.
So how does she become such a media and cultural sensation? Because I've moved to the UK now 18 years ago, and yes, I always considered her as a Supreme Court justice. That's quite extremely impressive. But she definitely, in the last last 10 years or so, she just became this media and cultural sensation.
Yeah, it was really in 2013 when her sort of celebrity star started to rise. As you say, like she had worked on the Supreme Court for a couple decades quite quietly, like nobody was really talking about her, thinking about her. She certainly didn't have a nickname. People weren't making like videos and internet memes about her. That would be weird. But in 2013 and 2014, as the court was starting to move to the right, the justice started writing some dissents to majority opinions that were a little sharper than things she had written in the past, where she really, as I say, she kind of liked to have writing that was going to appeal not just to lawyers and judges, but that the general public were going to be able to get. The most famous one was in a case called Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which was had to do with the weakening of the Voting Rights Act, the American law from 1965 that that protected rights of, like, it was a sort of federal protections of voting rights, particularly in the South, trying to stave off situations where Southern states would try to keep Black voters from the polls in all kinds of nefarious, frankly, ways. That law had been enforced for some time. It was challenged in 2013, and by a 5-4 majority, the Supreme Court weakened some of the Voting Rights Act, made it a little bit easier for Southern states to have discrimination against Black voters. The court's reasoning, Chief Justice Roberts wrote the ruling, the court's reasoning was basically like, oh, discrimination is like, you know, our country has changed, were his words, but like kind of, discrimination's over. Like, you know, look, we've had a Black president, like it's all fine now. And Justice Ginsburg wrote a really strong dissent saying, I think the court is making a huge, both legal and factual mistake in this case. And her words were like, taking away these voter protections because they're working, because they prevented some voting discrimination. Her quote is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet.
Yeah, I think
that analogy was so strong that it just became really well known. People loved it. It was a great, great turn of phrase, and actually a very accurate analogy to what was happening. And events in the subsequent 7 years have really borne out what she was concerned about. So as a result, starting with young law students and then kind of catching on, people started. They gave her the name, the Notorious RBG, after the Notorious BIG. People started making these little internet memes. They they took a photo of her and then they sort of photoshopped it red and put like a little, chalk-like crown on top of it, and the slogan, "You can't spell truth without Ruth." And like that image was like blanketed. Somebody went around Capitol Hill and just put that on cars and put it on the streets and posted it on trees. People started making t-shirts. People started, like, it became this thing. And of course it was funny. It was funny because she was elderly and tiny and the opposite of the Notorious B.I.G. And then she kind of seemed to enjoy it. Like when people would ask about her, she'd be like, oh yes, me and Notorious B.I.G. had a lot in common. We were both born and bred in Brooklyn, New York. And that was like a huge applause line. People would sort of go nuts. And like, it just sort of organically grew into this big movement. Then of course, this is 2013, 2014. Then, of course, in 2016, Trump is elected, and the left is even more concerned about about the country's move to the right. And as a dissenter, she just became a symbol of, of sort of standing up to that.
Maybe, and that's a good point. I had not even thought of that. In a, both sides you could argue, but certainly in the left, looking for someone. I mean, who else was there out there in sort of the political realm that and here's someone who had this history and was well spoken and principled, and certainly someone that you could, like someone said, she, I think is it Gloria Steinem, that she closest thing that she could think of as a superhero.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there would have been plenty of people, more of the left kind of in Congress, like figures that were out there speaking up, but like it worked better with RBG because of who she was, because she was quiet and intellectual and tiny. Like she's real. I'm a small person, and she was teeny. She was under 5 feet, and amazing. Very thin and very and she's a Jewish grandmother, and she came off as a Jewish grandmother. So the fact of this person as being like the tough protector of rights, like people just seemed to love it. And the fact that she enjoyed it was great. And then, as I say, when Trump was elected and there became, the concern about whether she frankly could outlast him, there, on Saturday Night Live, the impersonation of her that Kate McKinnon did that was just so hilarious, where she's like dancing and crazy. Of course, the opposite of what RBG really
exact
did.
opposite, yeah.
But like that's why it was funny,
yeah.
And it just and because Justice Ginsburg was out there publicly a lot, doing a lot of talks, and then even like performing in an opera and stuff, it just became like a thing.
Yeah, I think. I mean, we could probably talk about her forever. I mean, for several more hours. I think what would be good to maybe think more about the film specifically. I mean, what do you think? Well, what do you think her legacy is really, and what do you want this film's legacy to be?
Yeah, I mean, you know, they're very much, you know, I mean, I think we want the film's legacy just about people being able to understand the role that she played in American history. And you know, as for her own legacy, I think there's sort of two parts to it. One is the incontrovertible fact of what she did as a young lawyer to advance women's rights and the equality of the two genders under the Constitution. Like she changed the law for American women, as a number of our commentators say in the film, and that's something that just will stand forever. The other part of her legacy is a little more open to question, which is, you know, a Supreme Court justice never wants to write a dissent. You want to write the majority opinion because that's the law of the land. The dissent is just that you saying like, oh, here are the arguments why I wish it were another way. But one of the reasons it's important to write a dissent is not only to show the public and other lawyers, whatever, like, hey, here's why what just happened was wrong or dangerous. The dream of the dissenter is that the ideas that they lay out will someday later be picked up on and become part of a future majority opinion when the world turns in a better direction and people start to see it your way. And so I'm sure that Justice Ginsburg would hope that her legacy would be words that she wrote in dissent flipping around and becoming the basis for a later majority opinion.
Yeah. And, you know, since after, you know, Justice O'Connor retired, but she was then later joined by two other female justices, Sotomayor and Kagan. Now we know, let's not get into the politics of whys or wherefores in terms of what the Republicans are doing in terms of pushing this nomination ahead, but in light of 2016. But Mr. Trump, President Trump has nominated Amy Coney Barrett. What do you think Ruth Bader Justice Ginsburg would think of Amy Coney Barrett?
You know, I don't exactly want to speak for her. Justice Ginsburg did have a way of wanting to get along with her fellow justices, and even seemed to have developed a pretty decent cordial relationship with Justice Kavanaugh after his confirmation. That's kind of the way of the court, and it meant a lot to her. So I'm sure she could have been, you know, had a cordial relationship with Amy Coney Barrett should she become a Supreme Court justice as well. Obviously, her ideas on many of the issues wouldn't be aligned with RBG's ideas. I think whether or not she's confirmed, given a number of crazy factors with this fast-moving marriage is actually very much up in the air right now. That said, I would be relatively confident that the next Supreme Court justice is going to be a woman, whether it's Amy Coney Barrett or someone else. I think filling the RBG seat with a woman is symbolically important in a way that both liberals and conservatives understand. You know, one interesting effect of our film, or something that we learned from our film, was how many fans Justice Ginsburg had, particularly among conservative women. And Amy Coney Barrett, by the way, is one of them. She, she may not agree with a lot of RBG's opinions, but she does understand what she did for women's rights, and she understands that she herself benefited from that. And so,
Well, I mean, you've got a conservative stalwart in Senator Orrin Hatch, who you get on camera a few times, who obviously was a fan or is a fan of.
Absolutely was a big fan, and even said in a moment of the interview that we didn't include in the film because it felt almost so. He's just like, I love Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah, exactly.
He really just seemed that was sort of took us aback. He really seemed just completely dazzled about her. I think he even said like so cute at one point. Like,
yeah, I mean it takes us, because I do want to talk about some other things that you're working on and other aspects of the film. But I mean, one thing this also does is it harkens back to a time that just seems like ancient history now. This bipartisanship, that in the sense that justices would get confirmed once they'd gone through a hearing. The Senate vote would usually be 90-something to whatever.
As much as people might think of RBG as a divisive figure now, she was confirmed by the U.S. Senate 96-3.
Yeah.
Justice Scalia, the icon of legal conservatism, was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. Like, it's kind of hard to picture that happening now. Like, it's hard to picture a Supreme Court, vote that doesn't come down along party lines, which, as Justice Ginsburg said very clearly, was really sad to her. Before the sexual assault allegations came out against Brett Kavanaugh, then Judge Kavanaugh, she had actually spoken out in favor of, let's get rid of the partisanship. If the guy's qualified to be a judge, he should be confirmed. Then she pulled back from that when there became the Me Too issue, because she was a supporter of the Me Too movement.
Okay. How did this film get started? Was this you, your co-director, Betsy West, who we don't have here today, but where did this idea come from to do a film about Justice Ginsburg?
Yes. So the idea did come from us. Both myself and Betsy had previously interviewed Justice Ginsburg for two totally separate projects. So she was kind of a topic of conversation between us. Betsy had interviewed her in 2011. I had interviewed her in 2013. Both of these were before the whole notorious RBG thing took off. Yeah. And then it did take off, and she seemed to be becoming a bigger and bigger deal. And we were noticing kind of the humor of it, and yet thinking like, wow, all these people who were talking about, who were putting her face on t-shirts and even getting RBG tattoos, like a crazy thing that started to happen. And a lot of them don't really know what she did in the 70s and it's just like it's a perfect opportunity to make a film that appears to be about the unlikely celebrity, icon status of this like 84-year-old woman at the time, but is actually about how to achieve rights under the Constitution. So it was like such a good combination of fun kookiness and like really deep substance. So it was like, someone ought to make a film about her, and like, why not? Why shouldn't that be us?
But a lot of people have great ideas for films, but how did you actually get this off the ground? How did you gain access to her? I mean, you said you'd interviewed her before, but was she keen? Was she initially a bit reserved about it?
No, she wasn't. And the thing that, turn something from like someone's like, sparkle in their eye idea to an actual film is like just a lot of persistence. Because we had previously interviewed her was put us in a position where we could write a request to her that we were pretty sure was going to get put in front of her by an assistant. So we basically crafted a very reasoned email sort of making the case that we wanted to make a documentary about her, and she did in fact get that quickly and answer and sent us an email back quickly, which basically said not yet, the time isn't right for such a thing. The reason that there's a film is that we decided not to take that as a no. We were like, okay, we almost took it, I say this sometimes to young filmmakers who are like, because it almost never happens when you want to do something that everyone's just like, yeah, great, come here. Like, that's just not how the world works. Either you get a no or you get a maybe. And to me, one of the key things of filmmaking is to figure out how to take a maybe, turn a maybe into a yes. If someone says no, like, forget it, it's not going to happen. Like, you just back up and go away. But if there's a little crack of, a light in the door, then jam your foot in there and start.
Exactly. The timing's not right equals yes.
Exactly. The time's not okay, so it'll be right. It'll be right later. And we basically spent the next you know, year and a half to get her to let us move forward a bit, and that the parts of the film that actually include her in them are the very last things that we filmed. We started making the film around her, but with her permission, we eventually got her permission to start interviewing other people.
Okay. And you get Bill Clinton on. I mean, how you must have some strings you're able to pull to get some of these people on.
You know, both myself and Betsy were journalists for a long time. Where she was at ABC and CBS News. I was at NBC News. So we're not kids, so we know lots of people. You do everything you can to get a request in front of the people. And then, I mean, I think the Clinton interview took us like 9 months to get it, just like calling people again and again. And we want to talk to them for 15 minutes, but you just Orrin Hatch was the same way. Oh my God, a zillion times we had called, we had whatever. And then we ended up on a time we were doing a shoot with Justice Ginsburg in the Supreme Court. I actually just ran over to his Senate office, where it turned out that one of his student interns who was manning the desk, you know, a Brigham Young student from the very conservative, you know, Mormon college in Utah, was like, oh, RBG, I love RBG. I'm like, okay, well, you tell your boss to give me a call, and you know, eventually we got the interview.
It's about getting past these gatekeepers, isn't it? A lot of times, because once these people are on, they're happy to talk.
Yes.
And so the film's successful. Sundance grossed $14 million, at least the last thing I saw. Academy Award nomination. 2018 was this amazing year for docs. 5 of the top grossing docs of all time.
Yep.
You had Won't You Be My Neighbor, They Should Outgrow Old, Free Solo, Yours, to name a few, Three Identical Strangers. Do you ever wish you'd gotten the film out earlier or waited a year just so you weren't up against all those films when you were going for an Academy Award? I mean...
Oh, that's weird. You know, we never really thought of it that way. It kind of felt like the opposite. It felt really special to be in the year of docs when everyone was talking about docs. And of those that you list, ours was actually the first to be released. So... I think our doc really helped the other docs get attention. And as they got attention, we kept getting more attention. Like, you know, when we came out, there was a whole round of stories like, oh my God, why is your movie so, like the whole round of it was like, why is your movie so successful? And then the next out was Won't You Be My Neighbor, which did even better. And as soon as they start to succeed, all the same reporters are calling us like, why do you think there's this? And like, why are people watching documentaries? And then Free Solo comes out and they're calling us again, like, why do people want to see documentaries? We're like, we don't know, but like, if it gets more publicity for our film, then great. I mean, so I do actually think that the attention to them helped us. So.
Okay. And how has this film changed your life? I mean, besides probably people think now you're an expert on the Supreme Court of the United States, but I mean, because this is, it's such a huge film.
Yeah, I mean, it changed my life. I wouldn't quite, but like changed my career. It did. I mean, it's certainly given us the opportunity to make the case for ourselves to make other films. And by that, I mean, to get, you know, you need somebody to give you money to make a movie.
Unfortunately, but yes, that's what it does take.
And the easiest argument, truly the best argument, is to be like, oh, well, I made this other movie that made money for these other people. Like maybe if I make a movie for you, it'll make more money for you. Because, you know, documentary filmmakers, like even of commercially successful documentaries, do not make a lot of money. Like,
I hear that all the time.
People made some money off our film, but I assure you it was not myself and Betsy. I mean, I'm not saying that we went broke, but like we did not make a whole ton of money off it. But the good news about the film being successful is that people are like, oh, what are you doing now? Like you make movies that make money. And, you know, when truly I feel like our subject matter obviously was a huge part of that, but certainly it's given us opportunities to make other docs, and we're very psyched to be doing that.
Well, so maybe this is where we'll end, unfortunately, because I know you've got to head out actually, but you asked the question, what are you doing next? What projects can you tell us about?
So, actually, Betsy and I have a number of projects in the works, both collectively and individually. And the one that we're talking about publicly, because it's been announced, is a film called Julia, which I don't know how this is I don't know if the British audiences are gonna be familiar with this, but there was an American television cooking icon starting in the 1960s, named Julia Child, an incredibly popular American cultural figure, less well known, we discovered in other parts of the world, which of course was the same thing with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we were actually quite surprised to get foreign distribution, because most people weren't really familiar with RBG, but seemed to connect with her anyway. Basically Julia Child was America's first celebrity television cook, and really changed the way Americans thought about food, like the thought that food could be fun and delicious and important. That was like not an American idea, just as it's not a British idea. It's like that's a French or Italian or Chinese idea, not really the American thing to make good food. But Julia Child was the one that made that happen, and has an incredible life story and love story as well. So
interesting. I mean, and is that yet? Are you still in production?
We're basically just doing the final stages of post. We've locked picture, and we're just doing our final stages, and that's going to come out in 2021. Sony Pictures Classics is releasing it, so you've heard
that here. I mean, quickly. I mean, obviously, COVID has had some impact, I imagine, on your on getting that film made. But how have you managed to get around that?
Yeah, well, we were extremely fortunate in the 2 films that we had in production when COVID hit were largely both shot. We're about like 90% shot. So we were able to, so we were in the edit phase, something that actually worked out fine for all of us to be sort of just doing from home. Our editors took all of the footage home, and we just all started working over Zoom. There was a piece of it, there were little pieces of it that we had to for 4 months, none of us left our homes. And then we went back out to do the final shooting that we had to do, and finished up the films.
Okay, so once again, that's Julia, and I do remember Julia Child. She's I think she even inspired a
there was a narrative film about 11 years ago starring Meryl Streep.
Ah, that's right. Well, and we didn't even mention there's a narrative of RBG as well that came out the same year as your doc. So yeah, so so that we can find it on which Sony Max, you said?
For Julia?
Yeah.
Sony Pictures Classics is the distributor who's putting it out. It's also a CNN Films film, as well as Imagine. So it'll be all kinds of places. I mean, one big impact of COVID is like, where are films going to be? Is it going to be in movie theaters? Are there going to be theaters? Yeah. All remaining to be seen.
Does it go straight to streaming? Do you even care about festivals anymore? All these things. I don't even ask these questions anymore because no one knows the answer.
Nobody knows the answer.
That's right. Well, Julie, I know we got to let you go. I want to thank you so much for your time and coming in on we came in on a Saturday. You're at home, but
thanks on the computer
for turning your computer on, closing the door so the dog doesn't get in. Thank you so much. It was great to we've been a big fan of yours since we saw RBG originally. It's been on our list of films we'd love to discuss on the podcast. So it's unfortunate the hook, I hate to put it that way, but the hook, if you will, is the passing of Justice Ginsburg. But it was a joy and a thrill to have you on to talk about her life and career, and highly recommend to our listeners, please do check out RBG. You will not be disappointed. I learned a lot about much more than you ever really knew about Justice Ginsburg. So that's still on various places, including Netflix and Hulu. I want to give a shout out to This Is Distorted Studios in Leeds, England, and to remind you to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.